What's up, folks? I'm JC Owens, and this is Rockmyworld, episode 35, The Templar Connection. Now, most of you probably are aware of my past membership to the Order, as well as a few other organizations that dabble in the same kind of stuff, alchemy and the occult. You know, I did this for many years before I ever became an Orthodox Christian. And obviously that didn't happen until after I left and made a lot of enemies within the Brotherhood proper. And that's when I got kind of, disowned by all of my friends and everyone I knew, or most all of them anyway. Those that did follow me out are unfortunately no longer with us. God rest their souls. The fact of the matter is, this topic comes up a lot, and people wonder, how the Order, factors into this, this overarching push for global technocracy. And, really it comes down to the fact that, the Order is the origin for a lot of these ideas here in the West, you see. After Christianity came in, it kind of pushed paganism and a lot of these ideas, off to the side, and they kind of were off in the Far East in a lot of these satellite places way outside the Christian domain, and a lot of this stuff was forgotten. That is, the secrets and, other parts of the ancient mysteries. Right? Now, after the schism in 1054, the church breaks away from the East, and it's in this time period that Western Roman Catholics start looking into a lot of these other ideas, and they start eking their way back into Western culture. This gets a particular boost after the creation of the Templars, and they're being sent to the Holy Land to so-called guard pilgrims. How just a handful of knights are going to guard pilgrims, really? And, many have kind of called BS on that one. What really ends up happening, though, is once the Templar Order gets into the Holy Land, they start being exposed to these ideas again, these pre-Aristotle pagan ideas from Plato and, ancient Babylon and, the Kabbalah and Talmud and all that have kind of grafted on these ideas from from Platonism, and brought it into Neoplatonism, and they grafted in the Babylonian ideas and all these things, and it became one system. And here in the West, it was kind of the alchemical melting pot. We've talked about that before. These alchemical melting pots. The West acted as the alchemical melting pot for blending all these systems together and creating basically what is a new neo-pagan system, which then birthed all the neo-pagan groups we see today. From the Freemasons and Rosicrucians and and the Theosophists to like Wicca and all these crystal bitches running around here. Like, all of this comes from this same infusion of ancient pagan ideas and mysticism into Western thought and culture post schism in 1054. Right? Now, most are probably aware of, Friday the 13th being unlucky, and you may be aware that that's connected to the roundup of the Templar commandery and, hundreds of others on Friday the 13th, 1307. Right? Now, a lot of them weren't executed right then. That didn't actually happen until, a bit later. The bulk of them were executed in 1310, I think it was. It was like May 12th, 1310. Was when the bulk of them were executed, and then the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, and the Preceptor of Normandy, Geoffrey de Charnay, were executed. and that's March 18th, 1314. So quite a while after the initial 1307 roundup. But in those few years, you had the Templars all over Europe and beyond preparing for what was going to come. And once all this had happened, the rest of the order kind of fractured off and joined groups like the Knights Hospitaller, Knights of St. John, and all these other orders. Many of them fled to places like Portugal and Scotland, in order to keep doing what they were doing in secret. Like, they, kind of acted like they weren't, kind of with the Templar Order and what it was doing anymore. But, even to this day, we're still turning up these hidden altars to St. John the Baptist. And, you'll see it's just his head on like a placard with some symbols and stuff around it. Like, this is part of the heresy that the Templars had gotten involved with once they went to the Holy Land. And again, this is where all these, globalist technocracy ideas spring from eventually. Like, it all comes from the stuff that the Templars dig up in the Holy Land. It's widely known that they dug underneath the Temple Mount when they got to Jerusalem, and there were things hidden down there, like the magic systems that Solomon was using during his reign, which is what we know as Kabbalah and, the mystery schools, sacred geometry, and all these kind of things. The stuff that, like, was practiced by basically every alchemist in Europe during the, 16th, 17th, 18th, early 19th centuries. It acted as the foundation for the entire modern world, as we discussed before. Now, after running off to these places, the Templars continued to plan. They continued to plan. They came up with this, this maxim, down with throne and altar, as their overarching mission as part of the great work. It is, it's foundational to the whole thing, is to get rid of both, the church authority as well as monarchs, and replace it with a system ran by, the scientific academic elite, right? The experts, as we would call them today. That's where, we get this idea of, like, only listening to the experts, as I talked about in my Jack of all trades video, right? Like, a big part of that plan, though, was to create a home base, or at least a few home bases, actually. One of these home bases ended up being Malta. Another home base ended up being, Edinburgh in Scotland. London ended up becoming a hub. But one of the major ones was New Atlantis, aka America, aka Amaruka, aka the land of the plumed serpent, right? You see, in 1398, the Templars, sent an expedition force here to America, with Sir Henry Sinclair at its helm, leading that expedition. And they arrived here in America well before Columbus ever set sail. Well before Columbus, ever even petitioned the Spanish monarchy, right? And, even Columbus isn't who he would purport to be. Columbus was actually what people would call a crypto-Jew, or a Marrano, as they were called at the time, which actually means pig eater. As you know, like, Jews don't really do pork back then, and, they don't today either, really. And, like, the whole thing about it was, they became what was called, also called conversos, which means converted. Basically during the Inquisition, the Spanish crown forced all the Jews in their kingdom to, convert over to Catholicism or leave. Or, be arrested, of course. And this is why you have Columbus sailing over here to America at the time he did. He and most of his crew were all conversos, crypto Jews, Moranos, whatever you want to call them. They sailed here to get away from that persecution, and most of them all belong to, the secret societies that had popped up all over Europe and, Britain, etc. at the time. Creating America was and is like a big part of their plan, and it is central, it is vital, because by creating America, they create not only a safe haven, a home base, an HQ for themselves, but they also create this idyllic place where through propaganda to other countries, they have been able to sell this down with throne and altar model to the entire world. It is no mistake that the descendants of the Templar Order, like the Freemasons, have been involved in every single revolution of the early modern era. The French Revolution, the American Revolution, the revolutions in South America, revolutions in the Middle East, and beyond. And you have these other secret societies in these places that are working with them. Right? Like the Muslims have their own version of the Templars that work closely with the Templar Order and have at least ever since the Templar defeat at the Horns of Hattin there in the Middle East during the Crusades, right? So, without America, none of this would be possible. If any of you are familiar with Scott Wolter's work, he has joined the Order. He's openly admitted that he is part of the Order now, and as I've told y'all before, one of the reasons I'm even allowed to be on here talking to you folks about this is because the Order came out a few years ago that made it okay for everyone trained in this stuff to come out and talk about it. They're so close to completing their great work that they really don't even care if I tell you. That's how scary this is. That's how close they are to getting this global technocracy thing that they want. I think that they are being a little bit prideful, and they're putting all their eggs in this basket, assuming that they're going to be victorious. I think that is a mistake. Hence why I'm even on here talking to you guys about this stuff. I think that if I educate you all enough and you can get, like on the ball with this stuff, like we can actually stop them before they get this global technocracy in place. Before we're all completely surveilled and controlled digitally with digital ID and all this other kind of stuff. I recently just saw that PlayStation has said that they're not going to be doing any more physical games, now that they're coming out with the PlayStation 6, I think it is. And I've talked about Fender and Gibson on my channel here before. All of these companies are going the same direction for a reason. They're all signed on to the same agenda, whether they realize it or not. Most people are like, well, it's impossible for everybody to be in on the conspiracy. It's like, well, not everybody is in on the conspiracy. As I've explained to people many times over the years, Freemasons such as those in the Blue Lodge are not even aware of what the great work actually is to begin with. They're kept in the dark. Same thing with all the lower levels of these secret societies. That's one of the ways they keep things going. They don't know. Most people aren't aware. Like, I had to get to the level of Commander of Knights within the Templar Order before I even was made privy to the greater overarching, plan and what all it entailed. And I still don't know everything, obviously. That will be reserved for those at the very tippity top. But I have filled in a lot of the gaps in my information over the years. I've immediately went to, deep diving into these records from the ancients and, trying to figure all this kind of stuff out. And they have their own historians, like Scott Wolter, who is, actively writing books and, researching all of this stuff to prove it out. And, like, you know, they are prideful at the end of the day. They do want people to know what they've done. They are incredibly proud of the work that they've put in so far and that their ancestors have put in so far. It's one of the reasons why they let Carroll Quigley write Tragedy and Hope in the Anglo-American establishment. To some degree, they do want you to know they can't help themselves. Keeping it a secret, you know, kills them. They want to get that recognition for what they've done, at least a good portion of them anyway. Some of them may have transcended that need, but more often than not, they have not. Right? They are still human after all. And we are all fallen beings that have, you know, weaknesses of the flesh, if you will. But anyway, that said, I've kept y'all on here long enough. As always, much love and peace out.